Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. The tomb of Qin Shi Huang, China's first emperor, lies beneath a hill in central Shanxi province. From a distance, the mound is unremarkable, gentle, tree-covered, quiet. Farmers pass it daily without pause. Birds nest along its slopes. But beneath that hill lies one of the most extraordinary burial constructions in recorded history. It begins with the emperor himself. Qin Shi Huang was not born a god, but he tried to die as one. He was born in 259 BCE as Ying Zhang, and by the time he was 13, he was already crowned king of the Qin state, one of many warring regions in ancient China. Over the following decades, through war, diplomacy, standardization, and brutal suppression, he would unify the warring states into a single empire. For the first time in China's long history, there was one law, one currency, one system of weights and measures, one imperial authority, and one man at the center of it all. The moment that unification was complete, something unusual happened. The emperor's attention shifted, not just to ruling the living, but to planning for the dead. The work begins according to ancient chronicles. Construction on his tomb began as early as his ascension to the throne. This would make it one of the longest continually planned burial projects in ancient history, spanning over 3 decades. Located near the capital city of Xianyang, it was built not simply as a grave, but as an entire subterranean world, a replica of his empire, designed to house his soul for eternity. Historical texts, like the records of the grand historian Shiji, written a century later by Sima Qian, describe in detail how the emperor mobilized tens of thousands of laborers. These were not volunteers. They were convicts, prisoners of war, and forced laborers from across the land. Some estimates suggest that more than 700,000 workers may have been involved. They began by digging down, very far down. Archaeological surveys suggest the tomb chamber itself may lie as deep as 30 to 50 meters underground, roughly the height of a 10 to 15-story building. The size of the entire mausoleum complex, including outer walls and ceremonial structures, spans nearly 56 square kilometers, larger than many ancient cities. But the deeper the excavation, the darker the story becomes. A fortress for the dead and like the pyramids of Egypt, which were largely built from above and left accessible through long corridors. The tomb of Qin Shi Huang appears to have been designed as a place no one would ever enter again. The interior layouts, still sealed to this day, is believed to mimic the geography of his empire, with miniature palaces, towers, officials, servants, and maps. Some say that rare gems were embedded in the ceiling to mimic stars. But the texts also mention something much more dangerous: rivers of mercury flowing around the tomb to simulate natural waterways. Why mercury? In ancient China, mercury was associated with the power of immortality. It was used in alchemical experiments and ingested as a supposed life-extending tonic. The irony was cruel. Many of the emperors who sought to live forever by drinking mercury died early from mercury poisoning. Qin Shi Huang likely among them. But as a fluid metal, mercury had a visual appeal. It shimmered like water, yet did not evaporate easily in enclosed spaces. If poured into channels carved through a buried palace, it could resemble rivers forever flowing, yet never spilling. And it served another purpose too. It was toxic, not just symbolic. And that leads us to the darkest question of all: the builders who never came back, according to Shiji. Once construction of the tomb was finished or nearly finished, those who built it were sealed inside. The idea was not metaphorical. It was deliberate. Burial. Some accounts claimed that workers were forced to remain behind once the tomb was closed, ensuring that no one could later reveal its secrets or gain access. Trap mechanisms designed to shoot arrows or collapse tunnels were supposedly built into the structure to deter future intruders. Others suggest that the emperor feared theft and desecration above all else. He believed that if his tomb were ever opened, the balance of the next world would be broken. So the most secure method was this: erase all knowledge of how to enter it. Those who dug the tomb did not leave behind blueprints. They left no maps, no exit paths. Site was eventually covered with earth, forested over, and allowed to blend back into the landscape. It became not a monument, but a warning. A tomb that could never be entered was a tomb that could never be robbed. But how many were left behind? Were they buried alive? Were they sealed in chambers meant to collapse? Were the deaths quick, or did they unfold slowly, in darkness, beneath stone? There is no inscription to answer this. Only the soil remembers. N. Unopened. Puzzling. Like many ancient tombs, the central burial chamber of Qin Shi Huang has never been excavated. The Chinese government has long maintained a policy of non-disturbance, citing both ethical and technological concerns. In the 1970s, and again in recent years, teams conducted remote sensing surveys, ground penetrating radar, core samples, magnetic imaging. They discovered vast inner walls, sealed platforms, and high levels of mercury concentration in the soil around the burial mound, supporting the ancient texts. They also found that the structure may be too fragile to open. The combination of ancient wood, layered clay, and earthen packing could collapse if breached incorrectly. Some fear that modern excavation tools would damage or destroy the very artifacts they hope to preserve. Others raise ethical questions. If the emperor intended his tomb to remain sealed forever, should it be opened? Untold numbers were buried alive to protect it. Is it not already a kind of sacred prison? And what would be gained? A look at ancient treasure, a better understanding of Chinese imperial life, or perhaps just one more reason to bury the past again. The soundless hill today. You can walk near the site. There are signs and models. There is the famous terracotta army, unearthed in the 1970s by local farmers, standing sentinel in long trenches outside the tomb, watching silently. But the mound itself remains untouched, not for lack of curiosity, but perhaps because, even now, the hill feels sealed by something deeper than stone, a kind of silence that can't be broken without consequence, and unease that something was placed beneath the earth and not meant to return. So the real question lingers, like dust in the air. Was this tomb sealed to protect the emperor's spirit, or to protect the world from what's inside? By the time Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE, the tomb beneath Mount Li had been under construction for over 3 decades. What awaited his body was not a burial site in the traditional sense, but a manufactured eternity, a subterranean empire, carved from labor and sealed with fear. The problem for historians today is that so little about the tomb's construction was documented in a way we can read. There is no master blueprint, no diary from a lead architect, no comprehensive plan chiseled into stone. The builders of the tomb operated under a cloud of secrecy, so dense that even now, more than 2,000 years later, we still cannot say for certain what lies beneath the earth. And that was precisely the point. You see, the first emperor didn't just want a monument. He wanted control over the dead as much as the living. He wanted order, precision, and most of all, containment. The chaos of life, of rebellion, war, political disorder would end at the tomb. Inside, everything would be arranged just as he dictated, with no room for error, no risk of collapse, and no chance of escape. But how do you build a structure like that? And how do you keep it from being discovered or destroyed? The art of not leaving records. In ancient Chinese administration, writing was power. Clerks, scribes, and bureaucrats documented everything from tax receipts to the weight of harvested millet. Yet with all this record keeping, there is almost nothing surviving that explains how Qin Shi Huang's tomb was laid out. There is a chilling implication in this, that the records were destroyed on purpose. It's likely that those who planned and built the tomb weren't permitted to leave their designs behind. Or, if they did, the plans were intentionally buried, hidden, or incinerated after the emperor's death. Not because they were unimportant, but because they were too important to be left in the hands of the living. Sima Qian, writing in the records of the grand historian nearly a century later, K may have relied on surviving oral accounts, or perhaps restricted palace scrolls. He reports strange details, like how artisans were instructed to pour mercury rivers around the miniature palace, or how automatic crossbows were installed to kill future grave robbers. It's hard to know how much of that is true. After all, he had never seen the inside. No one has, and maybe no one was ever meant to. The silence of the artisans. What happened to the workers who built the tomb? Some were convicts sentenced to forced labor. Others were craftspeople, bronzesmiths, pottery workers, woodworkers, painters, builders of stone, and experts in lacquer and ceramic glaze. These people came from all over the empire. They were transported in bulk, sometimes with their families, to work under tightly controlled conditions. It's believed that many of them lived in temporary worker villages around the mausoleum complex. Archaeological excavations in recent decades have uncovered housing foundations, communal cooking areas, and storage facilities. A whole shadow town built just to support the construction of the tomb. And yet, when the project was complete, those towns vanished. Some of the people were absorbed into other projects. Others may have died during construction. Still others, according to ancient legend, were buried with the tomb itself, either as sacrificial victims or as a kind of security measure. The idea was simple. Dead men don't talk. But imagine being one of those builders. Imagine carving long, underground corridors by firelight, lowering beams into an enclosed pit where nothing had existed before, following orders to create halls of marble and chambers of red lacquer, all without ever being told why, and knowing, as the days passed, that the structure you were building wasn't just for a dead emperor. It might be for you too. The terracotta sentinels outside the central tomb lies the most famous discovery, the terracotta army. When farmers stumbled upon them in 1974, they uncovered not just statues, but a massive underground garrison. Thousands of life-size warriors stood in formation, each with distinct facial features, hairstyles, and armor. There were archers, cavalrymen, chariots, generals, and even support staff. These were not decorations. They were defenders, built to protect the tomb from unseen threats, both spiritual and political. What's interesting is that these figures were not placed inside the central tomb mound. They were arranged around it, almost like bodyguards. And they were located in long pits with timber roofs, which were burned and collapsed shortly after burial, possibly as part of a ritual sealing process. Archaeologists believe that more than 8,000 figures were created, though many remain buried. Some are crushed, others burned, and many are still being excavated with extreme care. But no one knows exactly who made them. There are no artisan signatures, no identifying workshop stamps, just millions of fingerprints in the clay, most likely from hands that never got to see daylight again. Time that doesn't pass here. Something curious. Despite the passage of 2 millennia, despite wars, weather, and erosion, the central tomb remains unopened. In part, this is due to deliberate preservation. Chinese authorities have long hesitated to enter the mound for fear that doing so could destroy the interior. The chemical makeup of the inner chambers may be too fragile to withstand modern air, moisture, or handling. Ancient lacquer, for example, can collapse into dust within minutes of exposure. There's also the presence of mercury. Modern soil tests have revealed elevated mercury levels in and around the mound, supporting Sima Qian's ancient claim. But no one knows how much is inside, or how toxic the environment may be. There's a further problem. No one can say how the tomb was sealed. If trap mechanisms were built into the structure, aero triggers, collapsing floors, or suffocation traps, then even small disturbances could cause irreversible damage or injury. So the mound sits quietly, patiently, as if the emperor himself were still watching over it. When builders are buried in their work in many cultures, tomb builders left marks. Stonemasons in Egypt carved tiny symbols into the walls of the pyramids. Roman architects often left their names on temple blueprints. Medieval cathedral builders left graffiti, prayers, and shorthand messages etched into the scaffolding or buried beneath the altar. But in the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, nothing speaks. This silence feels deliberate, as if even memory itself was buried. Some scholars believe that after the emperor's death, a purge took place. Records were burned, witnesses silenced, and imperial orders rewritten. Others point to the political unrest that followed his death, a rapid collapse of his dynasty, rebellion, and civil war that tore through the new empire in the chaos. Much of the knowledge surrounding the tomb may have been lost, or perhaps was never meant to survive in the first place. The lessons of a sealed world. When you walk near the hill today, there are no great monuments pointing to it. It's surrounded by farmland, pine trees, and archaeologists working slowly in other areas of the mausoleum complex. The central mound itself, the emperor's final resting place, remains off-limits, and maybe that's where the truth lies. Inaccessibility, silence, designed so perfect in its secrecy that no one, not even history, has been allowed inside. In our modern world, we assume that the past can be uncovered, that every secret will be revealed, that somewhere beneath the dirt and rock lies a key to understanding. But what if this tomb isn't meant to explain? What if it was built not to illuminate the emperor's life, but to end it completely, to sever all threads, to erase all maps, to make memory itself impossible? Even though more than 2,000 years have passed, the burial mound of Qin Shi Huang remains undisturbed, a quiet, grass-covered hill standing sentinel over the plains of Shanxi province. From a distance, it does not look like a secret. It doesn't look like power. It doesn't even look like a mystery. It's just a gentle rise in the land, surrounded by farmland and trees. But beneath that soil lies something far more deliberate, a designed absence, a structure so deeply planned that even its inaccessibility was part of the blueprint. This isn't just a matter of archaeology, it's a matter of imperial thinking, a worldview so consumed with order, fear, and permanence that it buried its own legacy alive. Because when Qin Shi Huang died, didn't just leave behind an empire, he left behind a machine, and that machine was built to last. Without him, when Earth becomes architecture, the emperor's tomb was not a pyramid or a temple. It was a landscape turned inward, a geological reimagining. The mound that rises above the site is said to be 76 meters tall today, though some argue it was once over 100 meters before centuries of erosion. But this hill wasn't a natural feature. It was made, layered, engineered. Ancient records describe how workers reshaped the mountain slope and packed the earth to create a dome over the central chamber. They used rammed earth, a construction technique involving thousands of workers pounding soil layer by layer with wooden tools, compacting it into dense strata. This wasn't guesswork, it was standardized labor, calculated to form a mound that would resist earthquakes, floods, and time itself. And beneath that mound, tunnels, chambers, hidden corridors, not for the living, for the eternity of one man. An empire in miniature. Sima Qian's account, the most detailed record we have, tells of a palace beneath the ground, filled with replicas of towers and walls, rivers and stars. The ceiling, he wrote, was painted to mirror the constellations. The floor was cast with models of rivers made of flowing mercury. That claim, once doubted, has found disturbing support. Modern surveys using remote sensing and soil analysis have detected unusually high concentrations of mercury around the tomb mound. While we cannot know if these represent actual rivers, it does suggest a purposeful use of toxic material, either symbolic or functional. Why mercury? In ancient China, mercury was associated with immortality. Ironically, the emperor may have died from mercury poisoning himself after ingesting elixirs meant to preserve his life. But in death, the substance may have taken on a new role. As a barrier, mercury vapors are deadly, capable of deterring looters or desecrators. Whether spiritual or practical, its inclusion was not accidental. What else lies beneath the earth, protected by poison and time? No one knows, and perhaps no one will. Death as a political tool. Secrecy surrounding the tomb wasn't just a matter of honoring the emperor. It was a matter of political control. When Qin Shi Huang died, his death was kept hidden for weeks. His officials carried his body in a sealed cart filled with salted fish to mask the smell of decomposition as they returned to the capital. They feared unrest, succession disputes, and collapse, and they were right to be afraid. The Qin Empire unraveled quickly after his death. His son, Hu Hai, was manipulated into power by powerful ministers, only to be overthrown and forced to commit suicide a few years later. The dynasty crumbled. Rebellions flared across the land, but the tomb, that remained sealed, and it stayed sealed, even as the empire that built it disintegrated. That kind of permanence was not common in ancient times. Temples were looted, palaces were burned, tombs were robbed, and yet this one, this enormous, obvious temptation of a site, was left alone, not out of reverence, but out of fear. The crossbows that might still be loaded. Legends describe the tomb as booby-trapped, crossbows rigged to fire on intruders, shafts that collapse under weight, doors that lock once entered. These claims come from Sima Qian's writing, but also from folklore passed down through generations. Could such mechanisms survive to this day? We don't know. Wood decays, metal corrodes. But some ancient Chinese engineering was astonishingly advanced. Automatic crossbow triggers existed. Complex pulley systems were used in other imperial structures. Anyone had the resources, the power, and the will to create such traps. It was the Qin court. But again, we don't have proof, because we haven't gone in. And maybe that hesitation, that pause before penetration, is itself part of the tomb's genius. A trap that doesn't need to function physically. It only needs to work psychologically. A forbidden excavation. Why hasn't the central tomb chamber been excavated? The question has haunted archaeologists since the discovery of the terracotta army in 1974. For decades, teams have worked around the site, unearthing statues, weapons, chariots, and architecture, but not the tomb itself. Why? First, there are preservation concerns. The moment a tomb is opened, the environment changes. Bacteria, mold, humidity, and oxygen can destroy organic material in hours. Look to Tutankhamun's tomb for comparison. Artifacts were damaged simply by the flashbulbs of early photographers. Second, there's the technical challenge. The mound is vast and heavy. Digging into it without collapse or unintended damage would require massive engineering efforts, planning, and possibly international collaboration. Third, and perhaps most importantly, is cultural respect. In Chinese tradition, disturbing the dead, especially emperors, is dangerous, spiritually and symbolically. For many, the tomb should remain as it is, whole, undisturbed, and sealed by intention. To open it would not just risk physical destruction, it would risk cosmic imbalance. What if it's empty? Here's a thought. What if the tomb was never filled? Some scholars suggest that the grandeur of the mound and its satellite pits might have been intended as a decoy, that the real burial could have taken place elsewhere, in a small, hidden chamber in the mountains or beneath a lake. After all, the man who feared death more than anyone else might have feared being found too. This idea isn't proven. It lingers, and it raises an unsettling question. Have we spent 2,000 years guarding an illusion? A mound built not to contain a body, but to misdirect time itself. A monument to control in the end. The tomb of Qin Shi Huang isn't just a burial site. It's a manifesto carved in earth and silence. It says something about the nature of power, that true control doesn't shout. It waits. It doesn't expose itself. It endures, hidden. Most emperors left behind palaces, temples, records, statues. Qin Shi Huang left behind a riddle. One you can walk around, one that breathes mercury and suspicion. One that may outlast every regime that tries to study it. You can map it, scan it, measure it, but you can't enter it. Not yet. Not without losing something, perhaps. As we look at that mound, we are meant to ask, what did the emperor fear so deeply that even death had to be buried alive? And more curiously, what are we afraid of now that keeps us from answering? You would not know it by looking at it now. Just a low, grass-covered hill surrounded by farmland, but once, beneath the heart of Xi'an soil, there were rivers that shimmered and moved like nothing else. They did not gurgle or flow with rainwater or spring-fed currents. These rivers never hosted fish, never grew reeds, never froze in winter. They were made of mercury, a metal that runs like water and kills like poison. And if the ancient records are to be believed, they were part of a map, not the kind carved on stone or painted on silk, but a topographic illusion, a flowing metal model of the empire itself, sealed within the first emperor's underground tomb. Why would anyone build such a thing? How did they know how? And how is it that no one, even today, can explain where the rivers were supposed to lead? This is a story not about exploration, but about intention, about a man so consumed with unifying the world, he tried to remake it in miniature and then buried it where no one could follow. The emperor who dared to draw the world, Qin Shi Huang, was the kind of man who refused to believe the world ended where the mountains or deserts began. He united warring states, reshaped languages, tore down regional walls, and standardized everything from coinage to axle widths. But his greatest unification, he believed, would come after his death, when the heavens and the earth would converge within the architecture of his burial. That burial would not be simple. The early Han historian, Sima Qian, writing about 100 years after the emperor's death, described the interior of the tomb as a model of the known world, a subterranean palace of epic proportions. According to Sima, the inner chamber contained palaces and towers, celestial constellations above, and a flowing model of China's rivers below, made of pure mercury. He did not describe it as a metaphor. He described it as literal and artificial. Topography, a metallic landscape designed to move and glisten in the dark, illuminated perhaps by oil lamps, fueled by whale fat or animal grease, and protected by hidden mechanisms. It sounds impossible, except somehow it might not be. The science of poisoned earth when Chinese archaeologists began surveying the tomb mound in the 1970s. They refrained from opening the central chamber, in part due to preservation concerns, and in part out of deep cultural respect. But what they could do was scan the surrounding soil, so they brought in remote sensing equipment, Krina, radar magnetometers, and they found something odd. The mercury levels around the tomb mound were far higher than background levels. In fact, they were off the charts, up to hundreds of times the normal concentration for the region. The readings were especially high around what was believed to be the perimeter of the burial chamber. These levels weren't accidental. They weren't from industrial runoff or contamination. They were placed there. Some dismissed this at first. Mercury is volatile and can seep through soil layers, rising up from deep deposits. Others argued that perhaps the readings were exaggerated. But over time, as more studies confirmed the readings, skepticism quieted. The conclusion was uncomfortable. Whoever built the tomb, and whatever their reason, they had used a lot of mercury, and they had put it there on purpose. Rivers that cannot be traced if Sima Qian's description is even half true. Then, somewhere beneath that sealed mound, there exists a flowing mercury map of ancient China. But what did it look like? What did it represent? We don't know. There are no blueprints, no surviving diagrams, no written records from the Qin dynasty describe the internal layout of the tomb. Only the second-hand record from the Han period. But let's imagine the Qin Empire stretched from the East China Sea to the deserts of the West. It wrapped around rivers, climbed mountains, and ran through plains. If a miniature was made, it likely included the major rivers, the Yangtze, the Yellow River, perhaps even the Wai. Mercury would have been poured into channels carved in bronze or stone, carefully leveled so that the liquid metal could shimmer and flow. But mercury is not just decorative. It's a warning, a trap. Exposure to mercury vapor can lead to tremors, hallucinations, and death. Out to prolonged proximity without ventilation would be fatal. Even today, archaeologists wear protective suits when working around high concentrations. So who maintained it? Was it ever meant to be seen again? Or was the flowing empire beneath the earth simply a message for the heavens, a symbol that the first emperor ruled not only during his life, but after it? The alchemy of control in ancient Chinese cosmology. Elements were tied to governing principles: fire, water, earth, metal, and wood. Mercury, despite being a liquid, was associated with metal and water. Blurred categories. It was unnatural. It was powerful. The emperor had long sought the secret of immortality, sending expeditions across oceans to find the fabled isles of the immortals, consuming alchemical elixirs, many of which contained mercury. Ironically, these may have hastened his death, but the obsession didn't end with his life. By placing rivers of mercury in his tomb, Qin Shi Huang may have intended to carry the essence of the world, not just its shape, but its life force, into the afterlife. It was a final act of control, over the land, but over reality itself. The labyrinth with no guide. There's a strange contradiction at the heart of this mystery. On one hand, the tomb appears to be a map, a model, a microcosm of the empire. On the other hand, it is completely inaccessible. It has no labels, no entrance, no legend in the corner that tells you what the rivers represent. It is, essentially, a map that no one can read, not because it lacks information, but because it is too sealed, too perfect, too final. This is where the metaphor becomes clearer. The first emperor wanted to be remembered, but on his own terms. He wanted to show the world, but not share it. The tomb is a monument to domination, not education. It tells us nothing, but it reminds us of everything, and still the earth breathes today. Farmers still work the fields around the mound. Tourists walk the nearby museums and gaze at the terracotta warriors, but no one enters the tomb. The air above it is still, but the ground beneath it is not dead. Mercury moves slowly. It evaporates, seeps into stone and soil. It poisons slowly, invisibly. Some believe that even after all this time, the rivers may still run, at least in part, preserved in the cold, dark, airless vault where they were cast. If that is true, then the empire flows on, not through roads or laws or armies, but through shimmering death beneath a forgotten hill. And if those rivers were meant to carry a message, then the question becomes, Who were they meant to reach? And why has no one answered? If the rivers of mercury beneath the tomb of Qin Shi Huang were ever meant to be seen, then the men who built them took great pains to ensure they would not be seen again. You are standing now, not at a grand temple or a triumphal gate, but at the edge of a sealed equation, a riddle of stone and poison, constructed by minds you will never know. There were no blueprints left behind, no drawings on silk, no carvings in nearby temples. Just a mound, a whisper from Sima, and the stubborn refusal of the earth to yield its secrets. But if you stop and trace the landscape, there are details that survive. They're not dramatic, they're not even especially pretty, but they are persistent, and they revealed something that no inscription ever could. That the men who built this tomb were not mystics or artists. They were technicians, and they built a machine. The workers who couldn't leave historical records tell us that more than 700,000 laborers worked on the mausoleum. The number is enormous, almost impossible to visualize. That's nearly the entire population of an ancient capital. But these weren't slaves in chains. They were specialists, artisans, brickmakers, surveyors, laborers, drawn from all corners of the new empire. The first emperor conscripted them over decades. They lived, worked, and likely died near the construction site, gradually shaping the world's most elaborate mausoleum. But here is where the details get darker. Many of those workers were never allowed to leave. Legends claim that the craftsmen who knew the tomb's layout were sealed inside it upon completion. To keep its secrets safe, no names are recorded, no lineages traced. They became anonymous components of the system they created, and still, in a strange way, they are with us in the engineering. The decisions they made echo through the tunnels that haven't yet been opened. Still work visible only to the dead, and perhaps to us from a distance. A tomb that breathes nothing. The central chamber of the mausoleum, where the flowing mercury map was set to rest, is surrounded by layers of earth. That may sound simple, just a hill, but these layers were intentional. They were designed to shield, to create negative pressure, to contain air that doesn't move. Some modern simulations suggest that the chamber may still be largely intact, its atmosphere undisturbed for more than 2,000 years. No oxygen exchange, no sunlight, no life. Inside, the rivers would still reflect nothing. They would sit in silence. But why? Was this to protect the emperor's body, or was it to protect the idea of him? Mercury, in this context, was not just material, it was symbolism. It represented change and stasis at once, liquid that does not evaporate easily at room temperature, a poison that waits by sealing the tomb. The engineers preserved not just a man or a map, but an environment, a world within a world of compasses and channels. In 2021, a group of Chinese researchers published a study examining the orientation of burial mounds and imperial tombs. They discovered that the tomb of Qin Shi Huang was almost perfectly aligned along the north-south axis. This wasn't a coincidence. Ancient Chinese geomancers, using an early understanding of magnetism, were likely employing compasses far earlier than previously believed. These weren't pocket compasses like you'd find in a modern survival kit. They were spoon-shaped instruments carved from lodestone, laid on polished plates to spin freely and align with the Earth's magnetic field. Using these tools, the builders aligned the tomb not just for physical order, but cosmic harmony. They were creating a burial site in balance with the heavens. So what does that mean for the rivers? It suggests the channels of Mercury weren't random. They followed a logica. Cardinal geometry matching the emperor's vision of a perfectly unified empire. They flowed along designed axes. They replicated real-world topography. The tomb was not only a symbolic map, but a harmonic diagram, one that mirrored the order of heaven and the rule of earth. If true, it would have required extreme precision, especially considering how Mercury behaves. Engineering the impossible flow. Mercury is heavier than lead and more unpredictable than water. It corrodes metals, penetrates cracks, and requires smooth, sloped channels to flow properly. Even modern engineers struggle with it, but ancient Chinese craftsmen were not unskilled. By the 3rd century BCE, they had perfected techniques for casting bronze, tempering steel, and building complex hydraulic systems. They built irrigation canals that redirected entire rivers. They constructed city walls that stood for centuries, and they understood how to grade and level earth with remarkable accuracy. If any civilization could have created a flowing, enclosed mercury system underground, it would have been Qin China. They may have used sealed bronze troughs, sloped ever so slightly to direct the flow. The mercury would not have poured in torrents. It would have drifted, slowly, almost imperceptibly, like fog rolling over metal, and it would have moved forever had no one disturbed it. Perhaps it still does. Perhaps, if you pressed your ear to the stone deep beneath that mound, you'd hear nothing, but feel something, a kind of pressure, the weight of a thought held in place too long. Forbidden excavation. You might wonder, why not open it? Why not go inside and look? The truth is, the Chinese government has deliberately avoided opening the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, and the reasons are many. First, there are technological concerns. Excavating the chamber would almost certainly compromise its internal atmosphere. Exposure to oxygen and bacteria could destroy paintings, fabrics, woodwork, and even metal. Second, there is the problem of mercury. High concentrations of mercury vapor could pose serious risks to archaeologists and conservationists. If the tomb chamber is as toxic as some tests suggest, entering it would require full hazmat containment protocols. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there is cultural restraint. In Chinese tradition, especially influenced by Confucian ethics and ancestor reverence, tombs are sacred, disturbing one especially of a powerful figure like the first emperors, considered deeply inappropriate unless absolutely necessary. And so, despite our technology, we wait. The emperor waits. The rivers wait, and we are left with questions we cannot answer, not because we lack the evidence, but because we are not allowed to touch it. The map that led nowhere. Perhaps the most haunting part of this story is that the map was never meant to lead anywhere. Unlike modern maps that chart a course from one place to another, the mercury rivers in the tomb had no destination. They looped, they glistened, they repeated. They were made not to navigate, but to demonstrate a performance for gods or ghosts, not people. The empire was unified, it said. The rivers obeyed. The stars were fixed above, the lands below tamed, and at the center sat the emperor, no longer a man, but a fixed point, an unmovable axis around which time would turn. But of course, time did turn. The Qin dynasty collapsed within years of his death. The next empire rose with different values, and the tomb was forgotten. For 2,000 years, it's lumbered, and still today. It refuses to open. What the ground won't say where left, then, with nothing more than hints. Mercury in the soil, an uncut mound. A historian's words. It's written a century too late, in silence. You are not the first to wonder what lies beneath that mound, nor will you be the last. But the answers remain sealed, not because we can't reach them, but because someone long ago decided that we shouldn't. What were they afraid of? What would change if we finally uncovered the map? What exactly was the first emperor trying to protect? You're still standing at the edge of a sealed world. You haven't gone inside the tomb, not yet, not ever. But in some quiet, invisible way, the mercury rivers below have already spilled out, not into your hands, but into your questions. Have saturated the imaginations of emperors, scholars, engineers, and wanderers. And though no human has seen those dreams in over 2,000 years, the shape of them can be traced in what the land remembers and in what we cannot forget. Because something strange has happened. The longer the tomb stays closed, the more clearly it speaks. Not with facts, not with relics, but with silence. And silence, when protected for long enough, it becomes a kind of map, not of land, but of intention. Where the earth was warmer, soil samples taken around the tomb have revealed something unusual. High concentrations of mercury, not just in the immediate burial mound, but in nearby patches of earth. And not just on the surface. The mercury appears in vertical layers, suggesting that something underneath is leaching upward. What does that mean? Perhaps the tomb isn't perfectly sealed. Perhaps over centuries, tiny cracks have formed capillaries in the bedrock, allowing trace amounts of mercury vapor to rise slowly through the dirt. Almost like a buried wound, gently bleeding into the air. But this raises a troubling question. If mercury is leaking, how much remains? And if the mercury was meant to depict rivers, actual flowing rivers of the empire, then what happens when the rivers vanish? Does the tomb lose its meaning? Or does the vanishing itself become part of the message? Maybe that's why the tomb was built so deep, so wide, so enduring. Not to last forever, but to decay very, very slowly, so that each century would inherit only a portion of the mystery, never the whole. When the dead wrote in vapor in the Han Dynasty, not long after the fall of the Qin, there were reports of strange illnesses among workers who tried to repurpose stone and metal from abandoned Qin sites. One location, not far from the emperor's mausoleum, was said to have made men dizzy. They forgot their own names. They vomited without warning. They became confused in daylight. These are, curiously, symptoms of chronic mercury exposure. But there is no record of the area being used for mining. There is no river nearby that could explain the contamination, and no one at the time connected these effects to the tomb. They didn't need to. They already understood, on some level, that the emperor's power had not ended with his death. He had created something that continued to act not politically, but chemically, something invisible, something that resisted control. The architect who disappeared, later scrolls, written centuries after the Qin dynasty's collapse, are references to a man known only as Shan, an architect or engineer, whose name was deliberately erased from most historical records. His designs were said to have been unlike anything the empire had seen before. Some believed he was the mind behind the tomb's inner layout, but the scrolls are ambiguous. Shand disappears. Before the tomb is sealed, no burial site is recorded. No family honored him. He becomes one of many blank spaces in the empire's memory. Some scholars believe this silence was punishment, that he knew too much. Others believe the opposite, that he chose to vanish, perhaps entered the tomb himself. If that is true, he may be closer now to the mercury than anyone alive. Not as a ghost, not as a name, but as a designer human who became a function of the map he built. Builder whose blueprint was himself. The cartographers Lilat say, just for a moment, that you could see the map beneath the earth, that the tomb cracked open and revealed every channel of mercury, every slope of bronze, every cavern supported by ancient beams. What would you expect? A perfect replica of the Chinese Empire. Mountains cast in gold. Lakes represented by pools of molten silver. No, what lies beneath is not cartography, 'tis philosophy. The tomb does not recreate China. It recreates how one man wanted China to feel unbroken, unquestioned, permanent. But it was none of those things. The rivers outside were unpredictable. Floods destroyed towns, borders shifted, roads collapsed under too much snow. Inside the tomb, none of that happened. The rivers flowed, but only in the direction they were told to. The stars stayed fixed above. The emperor never died. In that way, the tomb wasn't just a resting place, it was a correction, a revision of the world where things made sense. A false mapette, and needed one. What the map refused to show all, the details rumored to be inside the tomb. One omission is most striking. Nowhere in Simon Qian's description, or in later traditions, there are mention of the people. There are no villages, no commoners, no boats sailing the Mercury rivers, just the emperor and his unbroken domain. It is a map without human life, which makes it strange and sad, because for all its complexity, the tomb doesn't commemorate the men who dug the channels, it's the hands that poured the mercury, or the mothers who never saw their sons return from the work camps. Their lives were not cast in bronze. They were poured out in silence. And yet, that silence is what gives the tomb its meaning today, because the workers did leave something behind, not their names, but their choices. The angle of a wall, the width of a corridor, the grade of a slope that made mercury glide instead of pool. These weren't accidents, they were instructions, coded in stone, too boring for kings to notice, but too clever for time to erase. The last river end. Now, you're back at the surface. You haven't moved, but your imagination has, okay? Through sealed vaults, past hollow spaces and bronze slopes. You followed the rivers, okay? Though no one ever could. And what do you find? Stillness and empire whose rivers no longer run. A map with no labels. A liquid that reflects nothing, 'cause it was meant to be seen by no one. And so, it sits there, waiting not for discovery, but for forgetting, because maybe that was the emperor's true desire, not eternal fame, but eternal absence. A world that functioned without memory, without question, without change. That is why the tomb remains closed, not because we lack the tools to open it, but because to open it would mean accepting that even the most permanent things leak, that rivers of mercury, like empires and names and blueprints, always find a way to vanish. And perhaps that's what the map was always meant to teach us. Not what lies beneath the soil, but what always escapes it. When you imagined the terracotta army, you probably pictured the silent soldiers themselves, those thousands of great clay warriors standing in silent rows, still at attention after 2 millennia underground. Spears once gripped in baked hands, helmets shaped from old molds, brows set with the kind of determined calm only time can chisel. But what if you stood behind one of those figures, not in front of it, not facing it like a museum visitor or a historian with a flashlight, but quietly watching from the spot where the sculptor once stood? And what if, instead of focusing on the soldier's form, you focused on the hands that made it? Because every contour of clay, every molded boot, every slightly off-center ear or thickened eyebrow, all of it passed through human fingers. Not noble fingers, not royal, but the fingers of workers who were never named in textbooks. And if the tomb was the emperor's map of immortality, the terracotta army was the last echo of his breath. Not because the soldiers live, but because their creators were never supposed to be seen. And yet, they are still watching, because the clay remembers. And that's where this story begins. The first shoveled artisans did not arrive all at once. They were summoned over years, some as specialists in sculpture, some in masonry, others simply as strong backs with no knowledge of what they were about to shape. Most came from villages in the Central Plains, some from the Southern Territories annexed late in the Wars of Unification. A few were prisoners. They arrived not knowing the full scale of the task, only that they would be shaping something for the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a newly unified China. They were told very little, only this: their work would never be seen by the living, and so they began digging long trenches into the dry, lowest soil. These weren't graves, not exactly. They were corridors, outlines of what would become underground barracks, entire army camps formed not of wood or canvas, but of clay and silence. And from the very first shovel of earth, the air was dry. The wind blew dust across the backs of workers bent double. No shade, no breaks. Trenches, wider than roads, stretching farther than a man could shout. The molds that weren't there as a common misunderstanding about the terracotta army, that the soldiers were mass-produced using identical molds. It would have been faster that way. It might even have been easier, but that's not what happened. Yes, some basic molds were used for torsos and legs, but each face and, often each hand, hairstyle, and armor style was made with some variation, meaning that the artisans were not just laborers, they were portraitists, and the portraits they sculpted weren't based on living models. They were invented. Imagine that. Thousands of faces, invented from memory and imagination, pressed into wet clay by people who had no intention of signing their work, because they couldn't. Their names were never meant to last, but their fingerprints did. If you were to run your hand along the cheek of a terracotta soldier, you might find a faint ridge, not from a tool, but from a thumb. One push to firm, hesitation caught in clay. Some archaeologists have identified at least 87 distinct artisan teams, leaving behind small coded marks on the statues, not as signatures, but as accountability. If a piece cracked during firing or slumped during drying, someone would be held responsible, not fired, but buried. Sometimes, literally, clay from the wrong pit. The clay used for the army didn't come from a single source. It was pulled from multiple pits around the region, some of it coarser, some finer, some with higher iron content that made the finished warriors darker in hue. And here's where the story takes a quieter turn. In one corner of Kanorno, pit 3 far from the central trench where the main soldiers stand, archaeologists found a collapsed unit of warriors that were never completed. Torsos without heads, limbs without armor, some still resting on the bricks used to hold them upright during drying, and among them a layer of reddish clay that didn't match the rest of the site. It came from a nearby riverbank clay, typically used for roof tiles, not sculpture. Was this a mistake, a last-minute improvisation, or was it a shortcut by a team trying to meet a deadline? We'll never know, but what happened next was clear. The figures cracked, the batch was scrapped, and there's evidence that the entire team of workers was removed from the site after that. Not punished publicly, just gone. No records, no reassignment, no mention in any scroll, only absence in red clay. The apprentices wall in one unfinished corridor, tucked behind what is now called Unit E. There's a brick wall that was never meant to be seen. It isn't part of the soldier formation. It doesn't support the structure. It's just a small side wall, perhaps built to shield tools or unfinished pieces. On that wall, someone scratched a design, not elaborate, just two figures crudely drawn, one holding a brush, the other a staff. Between them, a small flame. This wasn't a soldier's graffiti. It was likely left by an apprentice artisan, perhaps in a moment of pause, waiting for his master to return, or perhaps on a final day of work, when he knew no one would see it. No signature, no explanation, but that drawing might be the closest thing we have to a self-portrait from the creators of the terracotta. Not the soldiers, not the generals, but the watchers behind the clay. Not all of them were soldiers. One of the most overlooked facts about the terracotta army is that not all the figures are warriors. Some are acrobats, some are musicians, others are stable hands, depicted in crouching poses, ready to groom or guide the emperor's horses. These weren't afterthoughts. They were crafted with the same care and tension as the fighters, and their presence raises a quiet question. Why include entertainers in an eternal army? Was the afterlife imagined as a court, battlefield, a performance, or all three? Whatever the answer, it tells us something about the artisans who shaped them. They were told to make warriors, but they chose to make people. The soldiers don't just stand or caught mid-step. Some lean, some tilt their heads slightly, as if in thought. And maybe that's where the true artistry lies. Not in the grandeur, but in the restraint. The decision to give even the emperor's shadow army a hint of breath. The clay that watch now, close your eyes for a moment. Picture the rows of warriors. The ones still buried. The ones standing quietly under low lighting in vast chambers, cooled by centuries. You are not watching them. They are watching you. Because somewhere in the arrangement of features, in the width of a jaw or the set of a mouth, there is a story that didn't survive in text. It passed through calloused hands, through scraps of bamboo instruction, through decisions made at dawn when the kill was cool and the clay still pliable. These weren't mistakes. They were choices, and they were left for someone. Not a king, not a historian, just someone. Perhaps you, perhaps no one, because the clay doesn't care if it is seen. It only remembers that it was made. Now that you've stood behind the rows of earthen soldiers, now that you've seen the fingerprints pressed into armor and the faint scratches behind an ear no one was meant to inspect, it's time to go further back, not toward the tomb, but toward the furnaces. The kilns, because the warriors of the terracotta army were not born in silence. They were fired, and those fires, like the hands that shaped the soldiers, were hidden underground, and almost forgotten. The mystery of the missing kilns. You might expect that an army of over 8,000 life-sized clay soldiers would require enormous kilns, giant brick ovens, domed and reinforced, perhaps visible for miles. But oddly, no such kilns have ever been found near the tomb complex. In fact, for years, this confused even the most seasoned archaeologists. Where were the ovens? Where was the heat? For a long time, the assumption was that the warriors had been fired in large central kilns that simply hadn't survived. Maybe the bricks had been taken for other construction after the fall of the Qin dynasty. Maybe the kilns had collapsed under their own weight. But over time, a more intriguing possibility emerged. The kilns weren't missing. They were hidden in plain sight, not above ground, but dug into the earth itself, near the very pits where the soldiers were assembled. Small chambers carved into the yellow lowest soil, lined with hardened clay or brick tiles. Their vents sloping upward just enough to draw air through them like a breath. These weren't permanent structures. They were temporary lungs, built to exhale only once, then be buried, forgotten. Like the army they served, some of these firing chambers were no wider than a hut. Some were large enough for 2 soldiers at once. Most would collapse after a single use. And that, perhaps, was the point. Nothing about this army was made to last above ground. It was a project of disappearance, the quiet science of clay to understand. Why these kilns mattered. You have to understand what clay becomes when it's fired. The artisans didn't simply sculpt damp figures and hope they'd dry in the sun. They were making ceramic forms hard, durable, almost stone-like. And that transformation required precise heat. Too hot, and the statues would crack. Too cool, and they would crumble with time. Most of the soldiers were fired at temperatures between 950 and 1050 degrees Celsius. This was no guesswork. That's modern oven range precision achieved 2,000 years ago in temporary kilns dug into the side of a trench. The surface of the statues was painted after firing, using mineral pigments like malachite green and cinnabar red. But the base, the figure itself, was only as strong as the hands that controlled the heat. The workers who oversaw this were not mere laborers. They were early materials, scientists, whether they realized it or not, and they worked in silence because there was no room for error, no second chances, and no witnesses except the clay. A death in Pit 1 in 2003. During a survey of the lower northeast section of Pit 1, archaeologists found the remains of a worker buried beneath the collapsed roof of a minor corridor. At first, it was assumed he'd been part of the construction crew caught in a cave-in, but the carbonized remnants of nearby wood beams suggested the roof may have been burned intentionally. Why? Because this was the site of one of the underground kilns, and based on the layout, it appears the kiln may have overheated. Perhaps a stack of warriors inside cracked. Perhaps the draft failed, and the flames surged back. The man's bones were curled as if bracing against the heat. No name, no tools, just one partial boot, scorched and fused to the dirt. There are no records of this death, no inscriptions, no tomb marker. But that corridor was never reused. No new soldiers were placed there. It was simply filled in, tamped down, and sealed like a burned page from a book that no one wanted to finish. And still, even in that forgotten space, the fired remains of one cracked warrior stood, its chest blackened, its legs fused to the ground. One of the few figures in the entire complex found still warm, geologically speaking, in the residue of what killed it, or perhaps who made it. The tool scattered among the fragments of the terracotta army are a number of peculiar items, wooden sticks with strange ends, some notched, others smoothed to a fine polish. For years, these were thought to be handling tools used to lift or transport statues, but newer analysis suggests something else. The shape of these sticks matched the internal curves of the statue's armor pieces, especially the laced shoulder plates and skirt ridges. That means these weren't lifting tools, they were shaping tools. Handmade, non-standard, likely carved by the sculptors themselves, adjusted to fit the contours of their individual molds. In essence, these were the paintbrushes of the sculptors, not for pigment, but for pressure, for pressing grooves into clay with precision. In one such stick, labeled simply as Object 43027, has a fingernail groove worn into its center, as if someone, over time, used their thumb to guide each press, leaving behind the shallow crescent of a life spent not sculpting art, but armor, not for war, but for memory. The clay horses and their feet may know that alongside the terracotta soldiers, hundreds of horses were also found life-sized, with flared nostrils and arched necks. But what's rarely mentioned is that the horses were built upside down, because they were hollow, and the hollow cavity had to be shaped from the inside before the rest of the body could be formed. So the artisans built them on their backs, hooves pointing upward like fallen animals. Then, once dried enough, the horses were rotated and given details, knees, bridles, even tension lines in their eyes. But not all horses made it to the end. Some collapsed during turning dot, and in the far end of pit 2, a half-buried horse lies with only 3 legs, 1 foot missing, the body leaning as if limping toward the edge of time. It's unclear whether it was left that way as a mistake, or whether the workers simply ran out of time, because the tomb was nearing completion, and the kilns were being sealed, and the deadline, perhaps, set by a dying emperor would not wait for perfection, only silence. The night, the fires, died toward the end of the tomb's construction. The firing of new statues slowed. Some corridors were left incomplete. Some weapons were real bronze. Swords and spears were pulled from the warriors and stacked near exits, as if to be reclaimed for use elsewhere. And in the kilns, the fires were extinguished while mid-bake. Charred logs were found near unfinished soldier fragments. The flames apparently snuffed out halfway through the process. Why? Was the emperor dead? Were the workers dismissed? Or were executed? There are whispers in ancient chronicles that some artisans were sealed inside the tomb after completion to protect its secrets. No records confirm this, but neither do they deny it. What's certain is this: the kilns never fired again. The corridors were sealed, and the clay that once burned with purpose went cold. The ash that settled if you were to stand in one of those firing chambers today You wouldn't see flames. You wouldn't smell smoke, but you might still feel warmth because the earth around the kilns retains traces of that last fire chemical signatures baked into the soil. Silent indicators that here, once, something was transformed, not just clay, but memory. And so the army waits, not just to be seen, but to be understood, because behind every arched eyebrow and upturned palm, behind every crack and boot print and broken spear, there was a human decision, a hand, a pause, a breath, a choice to make a thing that would outlast the one who made it. And that, in the end, is what the Terracotta Army really is. Not a monument to an emperor, but to the ones who were never named and whose clay still watches. By now, you've traced the trench lines with your thoughts. You've wandered through the tunnels of half-formed clay and breathed in the imagined ash of long-cooled kilns. You've seen the outlines of labor pressed into terracotta statues, of soldiers, but a fossil record of hands that moved quietly and without applause. But what happens after the firing, after the sculpting, after the drying, after the pigment is brushed onto clay lips and painted beneath hollow eyes? Who signed their work? And if no one did, why? Let's step one layer deeper into the quiet system that ensured the most ambitious funerary project in Chinese history would be both massive and anonymous. Names carved on the inside, though most of the terracotta warriors appear unsigned. A few rare fragments tell another story, etched discreetly on the interior surface of certain torsos, under the armpits, or along the curve of the inner thigh, are characters, tiny, brush-carved, or incised marks. These were not signatures in a modern sense, nor were they inscriptions praising the emperor. They were workshop records, a sort of quiet fingerprint, marking which workshop, team, or supervisor was responsible for the piece. The names aren't personal, most refer to units like Workshop 5 of the right or Supervisor Zhang's team. And these marks weren't meant for admiration. They were for accountability. If a figure cracked after firing, the leg didn't support its weight. If paint flaked too soon, the mark let overseers trace it back to someone. Someone real. Someone whose name didn't need to be remembered, only watched. The clay bureaucracy. The Terracotta Army wasn't made by free artists crafting masterpieces in solitude. It was built through a bureaucratic system of modular labor, something China would come to perfect in later centuries for infrastructure, bridges, even porcelain. The figures were created using standardized molds for the torsos, legs, arms, and heads. After assembly, artisans would individually refine facial features, hair, and armor, adding just enough variation that the army would appear diverse, individualized. In this system, the sculptor wasn't a lone genius. He was a node in a supply chain, an arm maker, a head finisher, a pigment, a PPLIER, an assembler. Each was part of a unit, likely led by a mid-level official responsible for deadlines and material usage. Even the pigments had their own handlers. Reed came from cinnabar, toxic if inhaled. Blue came from azurite, ground into fine powder. Black from charcoal. Each batch was measured, tracked, corded, then distributed in quantities enough for the number of statues to be painted. Each figure was a small, bureaucratic triumph. And still, after all that, the names remained absent. Not a single artisan is known, a personal name in any surviving official record from the tomb's creation. Because the point wasn't who made the army. The point was that it existed at all. One inscription that shouldn't exist yet. In 1999, archaeologists discovered an odd fragmenta, small terracotta tile, possibly a discarded shoulder piece or armor flap that bore more than just a workshop mark. It contained a name, but not a supervisor, not a workshop. It simply read, Lu Tan, third son. Nothing else. No date, no title. Was it graffiti? It's a secret. A desperate attempt to record existence. even if on a piece that would be hidden from sight forever. No one knows, but scholars noted the stroke order was deliberate, not hasty. The character for third was particularly careful, suggesting the writer wanted it to be understood. There is no record of a Lu Tan in the Qin dynasty archives. He was likely a low-level artisan, perhaps from the southern provinces, where clay workers were sometimes conscripted. That tile was found beneath broken rubble near edge of pit 3, nowhere near the center. Maybe that was the point, a hidden name for a hidden life, one that wouldn't survive the emperor's command, but might survive. In the fragments, the command to disappear after Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE. The empire faltered almost immediately. His son, Hu Hai, inherited the throne through court intrigue and manipulation, stalled not by merit, but by the prime minister. Li Si. In the chaos that followed, records were destroyed, opponents executed, and entire archives rewritten or burned to consolidate the new regime's version of history and the artisans. Many were sent home. May they survive, but some may have been sealed inside the tomb with the emperor, according to Han Dynasty historians. The story claims that once the inner chambers were completed, workers were trapped inside to preserve the secrecy of the layout. It's not proven, but mass graves near the tomb sites suggest large-scale burials of laborers and prisoners did occur during and shortly after construction, and none of the names were recorded because the terracotta army was not meant to tell their story. It was meant to erase it. The paint that disappeared overnight. There's another kind of disappearance. Here one, not of people, but of color. When the warriors were first unearthed in the 1970s, archaeologists were stunned to see bright pigments, brilliant blues, blood reds, even purple still clinging to the clay. But within minutes of exposure, those colors flaked away. The lacquer layer beneath the pigment, applied over 2,000 years ago to help paint stick, dried out and cracked in modern air, taking the color with it. In less than an hour, the warriors became the dull, earthen color we now associate with them. This was not intentional. It was accidental and tragic, because, for a brief moment, the warriors may have stood as they once were, fierce, colorful, alive with hue and tone. Then, like the artisans who made them, the color was gone, not burned, just gone. Dust carried off in the wind. Why they made an army at all, of course. The final question remains, why did they do it? Why sculpt an entire army from clay, bury it underground, seal it from the world, then vanish into unmarked graves? Why shape 8,000 pairs of eyes that would never see? Qin Shi Huang believed in control over the afterlife. His reign was marked by unification, standardization, and overwhelming force. He controlled scripts, weights, measures, currencies, and even thought in his mind, death was not the end. It was just the next empire to govern. And if he'd ruled with soldiers in life, why should death be any different? But he also feared what came after. And perhaps that fear required silence. No inscriptions, no glory, just form, just presence. A perfect army that never breathes. The clay that watches stillen so they remain frozen in place. Not as warriors, but as vessels of work. Thousands of clay eyes gazing toward eternity. Not toward battle, but toward memory. Each dent in their armor is a soft confession of labor. Each missing toe, a story never told. And the names, they live not on scrolls or monuments, but in the quiet craft of the statues themselves, in the even press of a finger down a sculpted cheek, and the brushstroke of a black brow, long vanished in the wind, in the choice to mold not for fame, not for survival, but for duty, and duty, in the end, leaves no biography, only clay. You are standing at the foot of a mound, a hill that looks unassuming, neither steep nor grand. Its dome softened by centuries of wind, top tufted with grass that sways gently in the air of central Shanxi province. No monuments mark the entrance. No gates, no guards, no signs. But underneath that mound, the first emperor of a unified China still lies. Somewhere the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, Xi's most feared and most enigmatic emperor, has never been opened. His body, according to ancient sources, was buried deep beneath the earth inside a vast palace complex, entombed beneath the artificial hill built to conceal him, and all around him, traps.or, so the records say, rivers of mercury, crossbows, loaded and waiting, in corridors so dangerous that even modern archaeologists hesitate. This is the story of those traps, the ones no one has triggered yet. A mound without a door. Let's begin with what's visible. From the air, the tomb mound is a gentle ellipse, about 76 meters high and 350 meters across at its widest point. It sits quietly 1.5 kilometers away from the pits that house the terracotta army. Despite its historical weight, it has never been fully excavated. Why? Because no one knows how. Unlike the warriors' trenches, the tomb mound itself has no confirmed entrance. No grand stone stairway. No visible door. Just soil and stone. In ancient times, the entrances would have been hidden and sealed immediately after burial. The Qin dynasty's engineers were meticulous, tamed the tomb to be eternal, not merely secure, but unknowable. The Han Dynasty. Historian Sima Qian, writing just a century after the emperor's death, gave the world its first and most chilling account of what lies beneath, and what he described has haunted archaeologists ever since. The Sima Qian account, truth or cautionary tale. Sima Qian's account in the Shijiao records of the grand historian describes a tomb so elaborate it borders on impossible, according to him. The tomb was built to mimic the entire universe. There were celestial constellations painted on the ceiling, a map of the empire sculpted into the floor, and, instead of water, rivers and seas of flowing mercury. The rivers were said to be engineered with mercury moved by hidden mechanical pumps, quote, flowing eternally around bronze islands representing mountain ranges and provinces. The emperor's coffin, possibly placed on an elevated platform, would sit in the middle of it, all immovable, unreachable. But Sima Qian doesn't stop at architecture. He claims the tomb was equipped with automatic crossbows designed to fire on intruders the moment the chamber was breached. Not just one or two traps, but a system of defense mechanisms designed to kill. Crossbows were rigged so that any thief who entered would be shot instantly, he wrote. And finally, he claims, the builders who knew the tomb's layout were sealed inside, ensuring no one would be able to return. Archaeologists today don't treat these writings as a mere legend. They treat them as a warning, because while no one has excavated the tomb, modern science has already detected something unexpected, something Sima Qian couldn't have imagined. The soil that breathes mercury. 1980. Researchers began testing soil samples from around the mound. Using modern spectrometry and chemical analysis, they found something strange. The soil contained mercury levels over 100 times higher than normal, and the mercury concentration was highest at the center of the mound. Even decades later, additional tests confirmed the readings. No industrial source could explain it. No natural mercury veins run beneath the region. There was only one conclusion. The ancient text might be right. There may be literal rivers of mercury still inside. But mercury is not just symbolic. It's deadly. It evaporates at room temperature, creating invisible vapor. Once disturbed, those vapors could escape. Even small amounts pose severe health risks if inhaled. The emperor's tomb, then, might be not only hidden, but toxic by design. A trap that defends itself passively over centuries, not with arrows, but with poisoned air. Traps without modern precedent. Imagine standing at the edge of the mound, the equipment in hand, ready to drill. Imagine puncturing the soil and realizing the pressure inside has built for 2,200 years. Would gases escape? Would moisture rush in? Would ancient chambers collapse from exposure? Would you trigger a domino effect of disintegration? That's the fear that has kept archaeologists cautious. Unlike tombs in Egypt or Europe, the first emperor's mausoleum has remained sealed. Since construction, there are no trial runs, there's no second chance, and there is no modern precedent. Even the decision to enter the Great Pyramid was easier because it had already been looted and disturbed centuries earlier. But this is pristine, and what waits inside might not be waiting kindly. The crossbows. That might still work, but what about the other traps? What about those crossbows? Some might imagine decayed strings and rusted bolts, nothing more than myth. But in 2012, archaeologists excavating a nearby pit found something unexpected. Qin Dynasty crossbows, still intact. Their bronze trigger mechanisms were rusted, but the tensioning system, the ingenious spring-loaded component, remained identifiable and well-preserved. Metallurgy of the Qin era was advanced, using chromium-based plating to protect weapons from corrosion. Some of the terracotta army's swords, for instance, retained their sharpness after 2 millennia in damp soil. If similar mechanisms were buried deeper in the sealed chambers, they might be sealed in dry air, shielded from oxygen, and still dangerous. Even now, some theorists believe the tomb's passages may include mechanical traps triggered by pressure, vibration, or movement. Perhaps, over time, they've deactivated themselves. Or perhaps they're simply waiting, not for a thief, but for curiosity. Why was it all built? So, why go to this extreme? Why would the emperor, already immortalized in power, fear intrusion so much? To understand that, we must look at how he ruled Qin Shi Huang's reign was marked by paranoia, control, and centralization. He survived multiple assassination attempts. He burned books. He executed scholars. He built roads not only for trade, but for fast troop movements to quash rebellion. 2. Knowledge was power, but secrecy was control, even in death. That philosophy ruled. His tomb wasn't built to invite worship. It was built to defy discovery. A private empire beneath the soil, closed off to heaven and earth alike. One final act of possession, even of time. The decision not to dig in 2025. The Chinese government still refuses excavation of the central tomb. Why? Because the technology to preserve what lies inside does not yet exist. If opened too early, pigments could vanish, artifacts could crumble, air exposure could destroy what time preserved, and if mercury vapors are present in high quantities, any expedition could put lives at risk. So for now, archaeologists scan from the outside. Remote sensing, ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry. But none of it tells the full story, because the tomb was designed to confuse, designed to delay, designed to ask, do you really want to know what's inside? And so it waits beneath the hill. Perhaps there are rivers of metal. Perhaps traps coiled like ancient springs. Perhaps nothing at all. But the silence remains. The tomb sleeps, and the emperor, surrounded by mechanisms of fear and illusion, lies untouched in a vault guarded not by soldiers, but by the weight of uncertainty. You are standing not at the entrance of a tomb, but at the perimeter of caution. The mound remains closed, untouched, heavy with time and secrecy. But let us walk around it, not just physically, but historically. Let us circle it like the planners once did, calculating its geometry, its silence, and its traps, not only mechanical, psychological, because the real trap might not be the crossbows, it might be the belief we are ready to open it. It begins with what isn't there. No, one has ever confirmed the presence of hallways, of doors, of a single corridor leading into the center. Some suggest that the builders sealed themselves inside, collapsing the tunnels as they exited, never to return. Others believe the entrances were masked behind layers of stone, so indistinguishable from the hill's natural geology that even satellite imaging has been unable to decipher it. There are those who say the traps are lies, that the warnings are exaggeration. But exaggerations, when written by survivors of a dynasty that vanished shortly after its emperor died, are often written with a strange honesty, because those who told the tale weren't praising, they were warning. They were explaining why not even the looters came, and that, more than the mercury, may be the true marker of danger, because every other imperial tomb from later dynasties was opened, looted, scavenged. Not this one, it stands alone. How a mountain was made by hand. Most tombs are dug into hills. This tomb was the hill. The entire mound was not a natural feature, but man-made. Archaeological surveys show it was constructed in deliberate layers of rammed earth, pounded down with stone tools, reinforced with clay, and lined its stages with stone walls and plastered layers. A mountain built from the ground up, one handful of soil at a time. Imagine that labor. Thousands of workers, possibly tens of thousands employed, solely to build a covering so large that it erased the existence of architecture beneath it. Every stone they laid was a secret kept, every foot of height a step closer to hiding the emperor's final palace from the world. And that construction wasn't just symbolic, it served as the first trap. Any intruder hoping to reach the tomb would first have to tunnel through a structure specifically designed to collapse under pressure. Modern architects believe the inner layers were engineered with deliberate stress points meant to give way under shifting weight, swallowing anything that tried to dig through it centuries later. The hill, in this light, is not merely a roof, it is a trigger, a passive machine of erosion and denial, untriggered only because no one has tried to enter from above, and so far, no one has dared. False paths, false floors, historical speculations suggest that the emperor's tomb was surrounded by decoys, false tunnels, misleading entrances, buried chambers that served only to confuse and delay. A trap, after all, is not merely something that harms, it is something that wastes your time. And in the 3rd century BCE, time was as much a weapon as steel. A looter digging blindly could have been funneled into corridors of confusion, into rooms with slanted floors, walls designed to echo sound irregularly, pits filled with unstable tiles, collapsing sand domes meant to look like solid earth. None of these things were science fiction in the ancient world. Even before Qin Shi Huang's time, Egyptian tombs employed gravity-triggered blocks, dummy rooms, and false shafts. The Persian kings buried in Naqshi Rustam placed their tombs high into cliff faces, only reachable by rope or deterrent, not through violence, but inaccessibility. The Qin tomb was something else entirely. It was designed never to be found, even if it was visible, even if you stood on top of it. Pressure-sensitive triggers. Let's imagine, just for a moment, that Sima Qian's words were not metaphors. Let's imagine that the traps he described were literal. What would it take for a mechanical crossbow trap to survive underground for 2,000 years? The answer lies in what archaeologists have already found. In pit K0006, adjacent to the main tomb mound, researchers discovered actual bronze bolts and arrowheads, some still aligned in launch-ready positions. Their placements suggest they were once mounted into walls, possibly spring-loaded or set on pivoting platforms. The mechanics were simple. A cord stretched across a passageway. Step on it, and it snaps, triggering a release mechanism. This isn't fantasy. It was documented technology at the time. The tomb builders, especially those under the direction of court engineers, would have had access to designs for military field tests. Crossbow traps were not theoretical. They were used in war. In war, for the first emperor never ended. The real function of traps, not to kill, biasing, but to delay. But here is where the boring truth seeps in. Perhaps the traps were not built to kill intruders. Perhaps they were built to delay time, to stall the moment of decay, to stop history from rushing in, because time is the great looter of tombs, and a chamber filled with oxygen begins to rot the moment it's exposed. Metal corrodes, paint vanishes, ink fades, terrace, papyrus curls, wood collapses. The best way to preserve a secret is to make it undesirable, to suggest danger, to invoke superstition, to quietly whisper, "Leave this alone. It's cursed." If that sounds familiar, it should. Later dynasties and even modern tomb builders used the same technique. A warning isn't always a lie. Sometimes it's a conservation method. And if the warnings of Qin Shi Huang's tomb are lies, they're effective ones. No one has disturbed it in over 2 millennia. That's not superstition. That's a blueprint. Traps of mercury, liquid at room temperature. Jade, in ancient China, a symbol of immortality. Qin Shi Huang consumed mercury pills in the belief it would extend his life. Instead, it likely caused madness, paranoia, and his early death. But in death, substance became his guardian. The ancient texts say the tomb's rivers flowed with mercury, sealed in channels designed to simulate the seas. Some even theorize the emperor's sarcophagus floated on a mercury lake, sat surrounded by untouchable, poisonous to approach. If true, then disturbing the tomb would do more than expose an artifact. It would unleash a vapor invisible to the eye, and mercury is persistent. It does not break down easily. It settles into the soil. It lingers in the air. If the tomb contains it in large quantities, in early soil tests show extraordinary levels, then to open it would be to create a biohazard site. And that, perhaps, is the final trap. Not a snap of a string, not a flying bolt, but a cloud. A poison that cannot be escaped, because you don't know you've breathed it in until years later. It's tomb engineered as a message. The most remarkable thing is that no part of this tomb seems made for the afterlife. There is no priestly script carved into the hill, no external offering hall, no pathway for mourners. It's not a monument. It's a black box, sealed archive of imperial ego, a refusal to decay, a trap for history itself. And perhaps, in its own quiet way, it worked, because you are still wondering. You are still circling it in your mind, asking, what could be so dangerous that it must remain sealed? Or worse, what could be so delicate, so irreplaceable, that it must remain untouched? And isn't that the most powerful trap of all? Beneath the man-made mountain near Xi'an, a silence persists. It is a silence not of absence, but of deliberate engineering. Not a void, but a pause sustained for more than 2,000 years. A silence so complete it has become part of the tomb's architecture. This is where the story of the traps becomes less about crossbows and poison. It's more about restraint. It is no longer about the mechanisms themselves, but about the decision never to trigger them. Not by looters, not by archaeologists, not by time. We do not know what lies beneath that hill, and that not knowing may be the only reason anything still lies beneath it at all. The decision not to opening the 1970s, when local farmers uncovered fragments of clay warriors while digging a well. The world took notice. The Terracotta Army, now one of the most iconic archaeological finds of the 20th century, revealed only a fraction of what the first emperor had commissioned. But despite decades of excavation around the perimeter, the central tomb mound remains untouched. The reason, a consensus that borders on philosophical. Just because we can open something does not mean we should. You might expect this to be due to superstition, but it isn't. It's about preservation. Chinese archaeologists, especially after the rapid decay of unearthed relics in the early 2000s, have become increasingly cautious. Once exposed to air, many of the pigments on the terracotta warriors' vibrant reds, blues, and purples began to fade in mere hours. Paint that had survived intact for millennia vanished in a single afternoon. The tomb mound, sealed since 210 BCE, is not just a container. It is a climate-controlled environment, even if unintentionally. The humidity, the air composition, the pressure all stable, all undisturbed. Opening it would change that instantly. It is not a matter of if something is in there. It is a matter of whether it can survive being seen. And so, for now, the traps remain untriggered, out of fear, out of patience, evidence in the soil, to learn without opening. Researchers have turned to the ground itself, using remote sensing, ground-penetrating radar, and magnetometry. Archaeologists have mapped subterranean anomalous symmetries, too regular to be natural. Beneath the hill lie grid-like voids, curved structures, patterns of density suggesting chambers, possibly staircases, and linear constructs that could be corridors in the surrounding soil. Traces of mercury spike well beyond background levels, more than 10 times higher in some readings. These are not surface contaminants. They appear to originate from beneath. In other words, the ancient texts were not lying. The rivers of mercury, the warnings of toxicity, they weren't symbolic, they were literal. And still, there is no confirmation of an entrance. If one exists, it has been perfectly concealed through geological mimicry, or being sealed from within during the final stages of construction. This raises a question few want to answer. What if the tomb cannot be opened without destroying it? Tomb builders, in the price of silence historical records, tell us that after the completion of the tomb, the artisans, craftsmen, and engineers who constructed it were buried alive within or near the structure. Some were sealed inside to operate final mechanisms. Others were executed shortly afterward to ensure they could never reveal its secrets. The idea sounds mythological, but it fits the Qin dynasty's patterns of control. Emperor Qin Shi Huang was known for suppressing dissent, standardizing scripts, and even burying alive Confucian scholars who opposed his regime. The tomb was his legacy, not just of life, but of control after death, by silencing its makers. He attempted to make it eternal, but those buried builders may still speak through their work, not their voices. If the tomb is ever opened, we may discover inscriptions, blueprints scratched into clay, or tool marks revealing ancient construction techniques, traces of their hands, their calculations, their final acts. For now, all we know is that thousands of them vanished after the tomb's completion, and the tomb has never been entered since. Imperial afterlife as infrastructure, it's easy to imagine. A tomb as a grand chamber filled with treasure. But Qin Shi Huang's tomb was likely designed as something else entirely, a miniature version of his empire, cast in darkness. Early accounts suggest there were models of palaces and towers, maps of the empire etched into the floor, constellations placed above on the tomb's ceiling, and artificial rivers made of mercury flowing through miniature canals. It was not a place to store wealth. It was a simulation of rule, intended to continue the emperor's governance in the afterlife. Some suggest it may have even included mechanical elements, a working model of an imperial city, perhaps with gears or pulleys to create movement. If true, this would mean the tomb is not just a container, it is a machine, and disturbing its structure, opening its chambers, would be less like walking into a room and more like cutting open a clock. Every part is connected. Remove one, and the entire design fails. The ethical trap hand. So we arrive at the modern trap. It is no longer the ancient crossbows or the mercury. It is the dilemma of opening something designed never to be opened. How do you study without destroying? Do you honor history without collapsing it? Modern archaeologists are divided. Some advocate for high-tech, non-invasive imaging, hoping that future generations will invent a safe way to explore the tomb without opening it. Others argue that if we don't open it soon, geological pressure and natural decay might destroy it anyway, so we may as well act now. But perhaps the answer lies in what the emperor himself intended. He sealed the tomb because he believed it would last forever. He believed his rule, even in death, would be untouched. What happens when we prove him wrong? And what does it mean if we don't? Waiting for the right questioning, the end. The tomb's greatest trap may not lie in its walls, in its poison, or in its corridors. It may lie in its unresolved invitation. The trap is in the curiosity, in the waiting. In the debate, every few years, a new technology emerges: a scanner, a drone, a data model. The world stirs with interest. Scholars whisper possibilities. But still, the hill remains sealed. Still, the traps wait. And still, we ask the same question. What would we find if we dared to look? But perhaps the better question is, what would we lose if we did? If you ever find yourself walking across a flat field in Shanxi province, your feet might not be touching ordinary earth. Beneath the soil, beneath the weeds and the grass, there may lie a structure untouched by human hands for over 2 millennia. It will not look like much from above. A small rise, a gentle mound, no stones, no broken walls, no columns rising skyward, and yet, under that shallow bump in the earth, there might be a tomb, a royal tomb, not marked, not opened, not disturbed. Because in ancient China, the emperor did not need to be remembered to be powerful. He only needed to be hidden and buried with him too often were not only his treasures, but the certainty of his story. A dynasty of burials. When we think of imperial tombs in China, our minds drift to the grandest, the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. But he was not the first to build an elaborate tomb, nor would he be the last. For centuries, tomb building was one of the first tasks begun upon an emperor's ascension. The moment a ruler sat on the throne, work began on the place where he would eventually be buried. In some cases, the construction of the tomb lasted longer than the reign itself. The Han Dynasty alone built dozens, from 202 BCE to 220 CE. Han emperors and noble elites were buried in sealed chambers, often beneath man-made hills or mounds. These structures could span entire hillsides. From afar, they looked like natural features. They were intended to disappear into the landscape, and in many cases, they succeeded. The unopened tombs to this day. Only a fraction of imperial tombs have been opened, and even among the opened, only a handful have been thoroughly explored. The reasons are many: political, cultural, ethical, and even practical. But they all point to one truth. China's underground history is still mostly underground. Consider the case of Emperor Wu of Han. It reigned from 141 to 87 BCE. His tomb, known as Mao Ling, is enormous, over 50 meters tall and spanning more than 200 meters across. It rivals the Great Pyramid of Giza in scale, and yet it remains unopened. Nearby, the tomb of his wife, Empress Wei Zifu, was found, but it too remains sealed. Even with modern technology, no excavation has been authorized. Instead, we've turned to smaller, nearby tombs of officials, of nobles, of servants, to piece together what we suspect lies in the imperial core. But that suspicion, for now, is all we have. Why not just open them? It's tempting to ask, why not just go in? If we have the location, the equipment, the interest, what's stopping us? The answer lies in a mixture of preservation, philosophy, and fear. Let's start with preservation. Ancient tombs, once sealed, become their own ecosystems. Temperature, humidity, gas levels stabilize over centuries. The moment they are opened, even for research, that equilibrium is destroyed. Paint crumbles. Textiles turn to dust. Metal begins to corrode. Wood collapses. we've seen it happen before. In 1999, when the Han tomb of Liu Shang was opened, it revealed an exquisite jade burial suit stitched with gold thread. But within months of exposure, parts of the tomb began to deteriorate from microbial activity dormant for centuries, now awakened by fresh air and human breath. If even jade can suffer, what chance do silks and scrolls have? And then there's the philosophical, the respect for the dead in Chinese tradition, particularly Confucian thought. The dead should not be disturbed. Burial was not just the end of life, it was the continuation of one's role in the moral fabric of the world. To excavate a tomb was not simply a scientific act. It was, too many, a violation of duty, a rupture in the respect owed to ancestors, even today. The term for tomb robber is loaded with moral condemnation. Not simply criminal, but unfilial. Archaeologists working in China must navigate these beliefs. Many adopt a policy known as rescue excavation, opening a tomb only when it's at risk of being destroyed by construction or natural disaster. Otherwise, they wait, sometimes for decades, sometimes indefinitely. The fear beneath the surface, but there's a third reason why these tombs remain sealed, and it is fear not of curses. You see, ancient tombs contain unknowns. They may hold delicate texts that rewrite our understanding of history. They may contain maps of lost cities, lists of forgotten rulers, or artifacts of technologies we did not know existed in that time. But if a tomb is opened carelessly or too soon, those insights may vanish. Once a scroll disintegrates, it is gone forever. Once pigments fade, color can never be recovered. And so we wait, not because we lack interest, but because we have to. Much too much riding on the hope that when we do open these tombs, we'll be ready to receive them with care, and that history will still be there, waiting what we know without opening, despite never entering. We know some things. Tombs were aligned to stars, oriented for the afterlife. Many followed geomantic principles, what would later be called feng shui, hillside orientation, river proximity, and celestial layout were all carefully calculated. Burial goods were selected not just for wealth, but for symbolic meaning. Mirrors to repel evil spirits, jade to protect the body, lacquer coffins to preserve the flesh. Some emperors were buried with miniature clay armies, replica cities, and even model bureaucracies, complete with officials and scribes. One Han emperor's tomb contained clay, livestock, kitchens, and musicians, all meant to serve him the afterlife. Yet none of it has been touched in our time. The silence of their chambers remains unbroken for now, but how many are still hidden? There's another twist to the story. We don't just have open tombs. We have unfound ones. Geologists and remote sensing teams continue to identify mounds and anomalies across the northern plains, dozens, maybe hundreds, unmarked and unstudied. Some are tombs of princes. Some may be forgotten rulers. Others may not belong to the known dynasties at all. There are tombs that don't appear on any record. No names, no dates, just hills and silence. So we come to a quiet realization. History, in China is still mostly buried. Not because we cannot find it, but because we are still listening, still waiting, still learning how to ask the right questions before we open the door. But how long can we afford to wait? And what do we risk by not waiting? What if some things were meant never to be uncovered? Or worse, what if they were meant to be uncovered only by those who first buried them? The sun has passed overhead thousands of times since the last living person stood at the threshold of some of these ancient tombs. And still they wait, sealed, untouched, buried not only under earth, but under policy, hesitation, reverence, and time itself. Some were built to never be entered again. Others were simply forgotten. but none of them ever asked to be found. And that is the puzzle. In an age of satellites, ground-penetrating radar, drones, and remote sensing, why are so many of China's imperial tombs still sealed? Why has history chosen to be so quiet, here quiet, but not gone? To understand this silence, one must not only consider the emperors, but also those who built the tombs, the engineers, the slaves, the artisans, the bureaucrats, the eunuchs, prisoners, the architects, and their assistants, the assistants, the map makers, keepers who never spoke, the soil that swallowed everything once the last brick was laid. Because the truth is, these tombs were not only containers of power, they were machines of erasure, and they functioned very well. Bureaucracy, a burial if you had lived in the Han Dynasty and had the rare misfortune or distinction to be involved in the planning of an imperial tomb. Your life would have changed overnight. You would have been reassigned, housed within the tomb precinct, and sworn to secrecy. In many cases, your family would be relocated with you not as an honor, but to ensure your silence. Tomb projects were considered high-security operations. Blueprints did not exist. Plans were passed orally. Those who laid the foundation never saw the roof. Those who carved inscriptions never read the full text. The system was deliberately fragmented. Every worker knew just enough to do their part, but never enough to understand the whole. This was not only for secrecy, it was a form of control, a way to ensure that the tomb would become a black box once sealed. Even those who built it would not be able to re-enter in some extreme cases. Workers were sealed inside the tomb upon completion, either to accompany the emperor or to remove any living memory of the layout. This wasn't mere rumor. Several ancient Chinese texts record the phenomenon. And while archaeological proof remains inconclusive in most cases, certain mass burials near tomb sites seem to support the practice. It was the ultimate architectural paradox, a structure designed to last forever, but never to be remembered. The politics of opening a tomb in modern China. Tomb excavation is not simply a matter of archaeological interest. It is unavoidably political. To open a tomb is to confront the past, and that past may not align with the present. Consider the case of Emperor Yang of the Sui dynasty. He was overthrown, his rule remembered as tyrannical, and his tomb left unmarked for centuries. When it was eventually located, debate followed. Should the tomb of a disgraced emperor be honored, excavated, or left to rot? Each choice sends a message. Opening a tomb is an act of interpretation. It can rehabilitate a ruler's reputation, or it can reaffirm his condemnation. Silence is preferable to controversy. In the 20th century, during political upheavals like the Cultural Revolution, many ancient graves, imperial and otherwise, were deliberately destroyed. Burial mounds were leveled, tablets defaced, treasures looted. Graves were not seen as sources of knowledge, but as symbols of outdated ideology. In that climate, to open a tomb was not an academic act, it was a provocation. Today, Chinese archaeology is far more careful, but the memory of destruction lingers. Caution has replaced curiosity in many cases. Excavations are slow, deliberately incomplete, or paused indefinitely. What was once crushed in haste is now protected by waiting. But waiting comes at a cost. The technology that waits there is irony. Here, in many cases, we have the technology to explore tombs non-invasively, but not the permissions, ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, resistivity, imaging, more tomography. These tools allow us to peer beneath the surface without ever lifting a spade. We can see chambers, voids, structural outlines. We can sometimes identify metallic densities suggesting chariots, armors, or ritual vessels. But these methods are interpretive. They show shape, not substance. They hint at presence, not purpose. And so, When researchers peer beneath a mound and see something, an oddly shaped chamber, corridor leading nowhere, a void surrounded by stone, they are left to wonder, what is that? A collapsed passage? A decoy room? Forgotten sacrifice? Or something entirely different? And still, they wait. The data is not enough. Permission to dig remains elusive. The lost tombs of the South, while many imperial tombs in the northern plains remain sealed. Others are missing altogether, especially in the south. Humidity, erosion, urban expansion, and centuries of looting have erased much. In regions like Jiangsu or Zhejiang, it is believed that multiple tombs of the Eastern Wu, the southern dynasties, conned regional warlords, are simply gone, collapsed into rivers, flattened under farmland, or built over by modern housing. Some mounds were dismantled stone by stone during the Qing dynasty to reuse materials. Others were deliberately forgotten, erased by new rulers seeking to delegitimize their predecessors. And others, they were never marked to begin with. In ancient China, unmarked tombs were often considered safer. A rich grave would attract grave robbers. Better to let the earth reclaim it fully. Families would place tombs in remote areas, sometimes misleadingly described in ancestral records to confuse thieves. In such cases, even the descendants forgot where their ancestors lay. So perhaps beneath a warehouse, a rice paddy, or a parking lot, a tomb remains intact, waiting, and completely unknown. What lies inside? The question is both archaeological and philosophical. If these tombs were opened, what would we learn? The objects matched the records. Many burial inventories were copied onto bamboo strips or silk scrolls. These are occasionally found in tombs that have been opened to records of what was buried, where, and why. But in some cases, the contents don't match the list. Items are missing. Others are present that should not be. This suggests tombs may have been robbed soon after burial, altered even before the burial was complete. Would we find texts that change our view of history? This has happened before. Akin the 1970s, a tomb in Mawangdui yielded the earliest known copies of ancient Chinese medical texts, astronomical charts, and philosophical treatises. These versions differed from canonical editions, sometimes subtly, sometimes radically. In other words, tombs preserve not just bodies, but alternate histories. To open one is to risk rewriting what we think we know. So why were they left unopened? 4. Many tombs. The reason may be simpler than mystery. Some were never meant to be found. Again, tomb-building was not only a statement of power, it was also an exercise in imperial anxiety, the fear that death would undo one's legacy. To counter this, key emperors ordered decoys. Some had multiple tombs constructed, with only one containing their remains. Some commissioned underground passageways, filled with traps, false sarcophagi, or sealed stone vaults inscribed with curses. Others went further. They issued posthumous edicts, forbidding any future generation from opening the tomb on pain of ancestral disgrace. The tomb was not a memory. It was a threshold to be crossed once and never again. And this idea, even now, persists. In modern times, the slogan of many Chinese heritage officials is simple: open one tomb, destroy one site. Better, they say, to wait. Because while science may open a chamber, it cannot restore what is lost inside. So we ask once more, what do we lose when we wait too long? But also, what do we lose when we rush? How long can silence preserve a secret? And when the seal is finally broken, will we even recognize what we find? Or will it, like the tomb itself, be something we were never meant to understand? If you stood above the tomb of an emperor and looked down with modern instruments, you might see nothing at all. It's just ordinary soil, scattered rocks, and tangled roots. Beneath that, clay. Beyond that, the slow patience of geological time. Deeper still, something shaped by human hands, shaped to be forgotten. The truth is, the unopened tombs of ancient China are not all mysteries of grandeur. Many of them are modest. Some may already be partially collapsed. Others were looted centuries ago, their treasures long gone, their chambers emptied but undisturbed by archaeology. But that is not the point. Their mystery is not in what they contain, but in why they were never touched. Why, even with the technology, the records, and sometimes even the exact location, we choose not to break the silence. This story is not about golden masks or jade suits. It is about what happens when Sri decides to remain quiet. A hidden network of burial grounds scattered across China's vast landscape are imperial tombs of every scale. Some are modest mounds hidden behind farmlands in Shanxi province. Others are vast walled precincts near ancient capitals like Chang'an and Luoyang. Still others are believed to lie undiscovered beneath modern cities, their foundations long since covered in concrete. Historians know of more than 60 known emperors whose tombs have yet to be scientifically excavated. From the unexcavated tombs of early Han emperors to the secretive final resting places of short-lived dynasties, a shadow archive of imperial death lies just below the surface, covered not only by earth, but by time, politics, and reverence. Among the most enigmatic are the satellite tombs, burial sites for consorts, sons, generals, and high officials who were buried near emperors in coordinated formations. Sometimes they mirror the celestial layout of stars. Sometimes they follow geometric principles of feng shui, but more often they follow silence. No plaques, no stone gates, just outlines that resist interpretation. To open just one is to risk disrupting the harmony of the whole, and so they remain unopened not out of fear, but out of inertia, because once opened, they are never the same. The question of preservation. Chinese archaeologists opened the tomb of Emperor Liu Shang and his wife Du Wan from the Western Han Dynasty. Inside, they found one of the most remarkable burial finds ever uncovered in China. Jade suits sewn with gold wire, bronze incense burners shaped like mountains, and lacquered coffins sealed in airtight chambers. The tomb had been untouched for over 2,000 years, but even with such careful excavation, exposure to air, moisture, and human presence triggered immediate and irreversible decay. Lacquer began to flake, its textiles disintegrated, microbial growth dormant for millennia woke, began to eat through pigment and parchment. The lesson was clear. Even with the best intentions, we destroy as we uncover. This realization now informs every major decision to excavate. It is no longer a question of can we open this tomb, but rather, should we? Each tomb is a fragile time, capsulates, internal environment, sealed, stable, and uniquely hostile to modern air. To open one is to break that balance, so the choice becomes not archaeological, but philosophical. Do we value knowing more about the past, or preserving what little remains untouched? Ethical considerations of the unknown beneath every and excavated tomb lies not only a set of objects, but a set of decisions. What if the tomb contains human remains in poor condition? Should they be removed for study or reinterred in silence? What if ancient texts are discovered that contradict official histories? Should they be published? What if the tomb reveals evidence of brutal executions, political purges, or inconvenient truths? Who decides what to reveal? And what if the tomb contains nothing, an empty chamber, a decoy sarcophagus, or a void meant to confuse looters and archaeologists alike? Would that emptiness still deserve protection? These are not hypothetical questions. Each one has been debated in universities, heritage departments, and archaeological conferences. The answers shift depending on the era, the politics, the stakeholders. Some argue that unopened tombs represent a kind of sacred ignorance, a space where modern ambition yields to ancient intention. Others argue that not knowing only empowers distortion. Either way, unopened tombs demand not just methods, but mindsets. The emperor who waits in silence. Perhaps no unopened tomb is more famous than that of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. While his vast mausoleum complex, including the terracotta army, has been partially excavated, central burial chamber believed to be beneath a 76-meter-tall earthen mound, untouched. Ancient texts describe a palace made of bronze, rivers of mercury, and traps designed to kill intruders. They speak of constellations embedded in the ceiling and of a coffin floating on a man-made lake of metal. And yet, do not know what's real. In 2002, soil samples from the area did in fact reveal unusually high levels of mercury. But whether this confirms the historical account or is simply natural contamination is still debated. Modern archaeologists have chosen not to open the tomb. Why? Because they are not ready. Because the technology to preserve what might be inside still lags behind the desire to see it. Because some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. So the emperor waits, and every year, that wait becomes harder to interrupt. The tombs we may never find. Not all unopened tombs are sealed on purpose. Many have simply been lost. Flash floods, earthquakes, civil wars, and dynastic collapses scattered the records. In some cases, no one even knows where to start looking. The tombs of emperors like Emperor Hui of Jin or Empress LZ are still unconfirmed. Their locations debated even after centuries of research. In other cases, historians know the exact hill, the approximate depth. The traditional name of the mound but excavation remains delayed indefinitely due to environmental concerns, funding gaps, or lack of political will. And some tombs were deliberately destroyed by successor dynasties, not looted, not opened, erased. Tombs as political statements. Their removal a form of rewriting history, but even destruction leaves traces, and the whisper of a tomb lingers in legends, in field names, in stories passed down by villagers who once dug a well and found something strange beneath the stone. A lesson in restraint. It is easy to imagine archaeology as a force of revelation, uncovering, discovering. But in the case of unopened tombs, it is a discipline of patience. The waiting is not passive, it is protective. Teams of conservators build artificial chambers to simulate ancient humidity. Historians cross-reference unearthed tablets with rare editions of dynasty records. Engineers model airflow patterns in sealed voids. Biologists analyze spores on ancient lacquer to determine risk, all in preparation for an opening that may never come. Because sometimes the point is not to open. Sometimes the act of not opening is the real preservation of history. What does it mean to let the dead rest? This question lies at the heart of every unopened tomb. In Western archaeology, the impulse has often been to exhume, to display, to study. In ancient China, the impulse has long been the opposite, to seal, to hide, to forget. But forgetting is never complete. Even when a tomb remains closed, its mound still casts a shadow. Its orientation still points to a celestial alignment. Its name lingers in maps, in poetry, in the breathless wonder of travelers who stand before it and ask, what lies inside? In that sense, the unopened tombs do not resist discovery. They invite contemplation, and they remind us that not all knowledge must come quickly. That some silences, when preserved, can echo louder than any artifact. So perhaps we will wait another generation, or two, or 100 years more. And maybe, when the time comes, we will enter not with shovels. Asterisk. Good night. Asterisk. Good night. Dot. 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 dot 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 T.